In this video, we will be going over the basics of biochemistry, specifically atoms, molecules, and bonding. I will be emphasizing the more important concepts in a crash course-like fashion at the high school biology level. The information used here is based on our university level course and its textbook, Becker's World of the Cell 8th edition. This is the first of 2 biochemistry videos, so be sure to check out the macromolecules video later. So, without further ado, let's learn about biochemistry. For an introduction, let's look at just some of the more biologically important atoms. And we have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. For the atoms, it is important to look at their valence electrons. Valence electrons can participate in chemical bonds. So we look at their valencies. Carbon has 4, hydrogen has 1, oxygen has 2, and nitrogen has 3. Then, from the atoms, we look at molecules. Molecules are made of atoms. For example, we have methane, which is a gas used as fuel. We have ethanol, or the drinking alcohol, or it can be used in the labs as a disinfectant for surfaces and equipment. And this is for what is referred to as aseptic technique. We also have carbon dioxide, which is CO2. And a bunch of other molecules are over here. The big question is, what do all of these molecules have in common? And the answer to that question is that they all have carbon. The carbon atom is arguably the most important atom because it serves as the foundation of a diversity of biological molecules. And these biological molecules include your proteins, nucleic acids, polysaccharides, etc. We'll cover these biological molecules in the next video. You might be wondering, why is carbon the most important? Why do they get to serve as the foundation? Well, looking at the structure, we recall that carbon has 4 valencies and is therefore tetravalent. Therefore, they can bond up to 4 atoms. And when bonded to 4 atoms, form the tetrahedral structure. Another component is that carbon can form various types of bonds. We see in the figure that in methane, carbon forms single bonds, but also in ethylene, there's a double bond, and in acetylene, there's a triple bond. Not only can they form various types of bonds, but these bonds are relatively more stable. For now, just think about why the relative stability of carbon bonds are important, and we'll come back to this topic later. For molecules, we just briefly want to review some functional groups, because we may refer to different ones in later videos. Functional groups, as we recall, are recognizable specific components of molecules that contribute to the chemical properties of the molecule. So just to name a few, we have the hydroxyl group, we have the sulfhydryl group, we have the carboxyl group, and we have the amino group. As an example, let's look at the amino acid serine. We will review amino acids later, but for now, we'll just use serine as an example for identifying functional groups of a molecule. So we see the amino group here, the carboxyl group here, and the hydroxyl group over here. Another important topic is bonding. In nonpolar covalent bonds, bonding electrons are shared equally between 2 atoms, and there are no charges on the atoms. In polar covalent bonds, bonding electrons are shared unequally between 2 atoms as a result of high electronegativity, and that is your affinity for electrons. And we note that there are partial charges on the atoms, taking note of the dipoles. Last but not least, we have ionic bonds that involve the complete transfer of 1 or more valence electrons. And do note that there are full charges on resulting ions. Now, speaking of bonding and molecules, we now will look and talk about a very important molecule, which is water. Water is composed of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Do take note of the positive dipole and the negative dipole. Water is the most important because of its properties. The first property we'll discuss is its property as a universal solvent, quote unquote, right? So we'll look at the dissociation of salt and water. So we have the sodium ions and the chloride ions. What happens is that water forms spheres of hydration around ions with their charged ends surrounding the ions. Water will not necessarily interact with nonpolar molecules in the same way, but will instead maintain hydrogen bonds between water molecules. The hydrogen bonds between water molecules is referred to as cohesion. Cohesion is your sticking of similar molecules. I mentioned these hydrogen bonds, which are also very important. Hydrogen bonds are your relatively weaker bonds, but they still dissipate energy. And this contributes to the important temperature stabilizing capacity of water. Let's just consider this importance. Hydrogen bonds will dissipate energy, meaning that these weak intermolecular bonds, hydrogen bonds, will break and dissipate energy before stronger, more important intramolecular bonds of more important biological molecules break. So just think about this in the context of living cells, which, by the way, are 75 to 85% water by weight. So now, let's apply some of the information we just learned to a discussion question. I used this discussion question when I was a teaching assistant for the cell and molecular biology course. Let's imagine that in my leisure time, I am allowed to enjoy reading a book outdoors with my dog. Biologically speaking, we see organisms, right? We have me, we have my tree, and my dog. And these are your humans, plants, and animals. Now let's focus on humans, right? Human organisms are made out of organ systems, which are made out of organs, which are made out of tissues, which are made out of cells, which are made out of organelles. And if we keep zooming in, all we're going to see are molecules and atoms. So I come back to the question, why is the stability of carbon bonds important for life on Earth? Let's consider the carbon-carbon bond energy relative to the energy of visible light and UV, a lot of which we get from the sun. So without getting into too much fine numeric detail, let's look at the relative energies. So we see that the carbon-carbon bond energy is greater than that of the visible light, so visible light will not break carbon-carbon bonds. However, when looking at the carbon-carbon bond energy relative to UV light, we see that UV light is greater than that of carbon-carbon bonds, and therefore UV light can break carbon-carbon bonds. Why is this important? So let's consider a follow-up question that addresses some bigger topics such as life and climate change. How would the degradation of the ozone layer and an increase in UV exposure affect life on Earth? The degradation of the ozone layer will increase UV exposure, which would in turn increase damage to cells on the molecular level and have an overall detrimental effect on life here on Earth. So the big lesson here is that with the biological knowledge that we are equipped with, we can appreciate atoms, molecules, and bonding, the little things in life, no pun intended. So be sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and check out more of our videos. I will be continuing this biochemistry series with another video on macromolecules. So stay tuned for next time.